Truth Caviar, the show about ideas that matter. Hosted by global thinkers Brent M. Eastwood and Vadim Bichutsky. Welcome in, everybody. Hope you all are having a great week. I am Vadim Bichutsky, and I'm here with my partner in crime, Brent M. Eastwood. This is episode 7 of the Truth Caviar show. I am really excited about this episode. Today, we're talking all about Tucker Carlson and his fantastic #1 best-selling book, Ship of Fools. Tucker Carlson is one of my favorite, not just talk show hosts, but people in this world. He's incredible. We all love Tucker. As you may know, he's the host of Fox News show Tucker Carlson Tonight and the host of Tucker Carlson Today and Tucker Carlson Originals on Fox Nation. He's an awesome dude, a great American. If you guys have not read his book, Ship of Fools, you need to read that book. That book is incredible. Every American should read it. When it came out in the fall of 2018, it shot up to the #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. Tucker is an amazing writer. He writes in clear, concise prose. He was on The Five, on Fox News' show The Five. I think it was a couple of months ago. And I think it was Dana Perino or somebody on the show asked him his advice on writing. And Tucker said, the only thing he said was basically learn how to write in clear prose. He's amazed that so many people, so many Ivy League graduates come out of college and they can't write clear, concise prose. One advice that he gave was to read Orwell's Politics in English Language. So this book, Ship of Fools, it was published in the fall of 2018. I think it came out in October of 2018, right before the midterms that year. So it was published before COVID, obviously, and before the George Floyd riots. But it was prescient. Tucker did an amazing job laying out what is going on with our country, how the ruling class elites have failed us. The title of the book is a metaphor of a ship where the crew knows that they are on a sinking ship, unable to do anything about it. Think of it as like a Titanic. You're on a Titanic and you know that it's about to sink, but you don't know what to do. So the main thesis of the book is that the main divide in America isn't between Republicans and Democrats. It's between the ruling class, the so-called elites, and everybody else. Our post-Great Depression economy benefits only those that live in D.C., where the government is located, New York City, the hub of finance, L.A., the epicenter of cultural elites, and Silicon Valley, where big tech is located. Many industries are downstream from finance. So as we've talked about on previous episodes, we have experienced a financialization of our economy. An ever-increasing percentage of our GDP is located in finance, and it's not good for the country. It benefits a very small number of people. The government gets bigger. DC never suffers. DC is immune to the business cycle fluctuations. This creates an uneven distribution of income, and that drives certain attitudes. Uneven distribution of income basically creates 2 strata of Americans. The ones that benefit from that, the technocrats, the bureaucrats, the Wall Street people, the Silicon Valley people, the cultural elites, the cultural and economic elites, and everybody else. So this divide, that at least partially explains, I think, the Never Trump movement, so-called Republicans who were against Trump, because on many issues, they actually agree with Democrats. That's the thesis of the book, is that we have 2 Americas. We have the elites and we have everybody else. Tucker asks a very important question. Why did America elect Donald Trump? He's vulgar, ignorant, bombastic, an orange man with a funky hairstyle. He doesn't speak in a politically correct way. He doesn't use the elite language that's ingrained into them in college. Ivy League graduates who man our elite circles. He has been accused of sexual harassment by multiple women
We've all seen the Access Hollywood tape. Nobody said, hey, the Access Hollywood tape actually makes me want to vote for him. Nobody said, hey, I'm going to vote for Trump because of the Access Hollywood tape. So it's not that the American people necessarily like Trump, although maybe some did. It's that they overlooked many of his weaknesses because the establishment, from the Clintons to the Bushes to the Obamas, failed them. And it's not just the politicians who failed the American people. It's also the technocrats, as we said, the bureaucrats, the woke capitalists. We've covered many of those topics on our previous episodes. See our previous episodes on the managerial elite, woke capital, and the Great Reset here on the Truth Caviar show. The main point that Tucker makes is that when a populist is elected, it's a warning to the elites that something is wrong. They aren't doing a good job for the people. That's how they should have reacted to Trump. Instead, they called the American people racists, sexists, cleaners, deplorables, irredeemables, rubes, etc. In Tucker's words, Trump's election wasn't about Trump. It was a throbbing middle finger in the face of America's ruling class. It was a gesture of contempt, a howl of rage, the end results of decades of selfish and unwise decisions made by selfish and unwise leaders. Happy countries don't elect Donald Trump. Desperate ones do.
Good point.
So in retrospect, the lesson seemed obvious. Ignore voters for long enough and you get Donald Trump. Yet the people at whom the message was aimed never received it. Instead of pausing, listening, thinking, and changing, America's ruling class withdrew into a defensive crouch. Beginning on election night, they explained away their loss with theories as pat and implausible as the summer action movie. Trump won because of fake news. Trump won because of Russia. Trump won because mouth breathers in the provinces were mesmerized by his golden jet and shiny cufflinks. Trump won because he's a racist. None of these explanations withstand scrutiny. What are the causes of Trump's election? We've had a precipitous decline in the middle class. In 2015, the middle class stopped being the majority in this country. Loss of manufacturing. As I said, boom in finance exacerbated income inequality, especially after the 2008 financial crisis. The elites are making more now since before the financial crisis. This has stratified the American population into winners and losers, those that benefit from our current arrangement and those that don't. And these elites, they never interact with regular people. They live in their own bubbles. Here's another quote from Tucker. The rich now reside on the other side of the rope line from everyone else. They stand in their own queues at the airport, sleep on their own restricted floors in hotels. They watch sporting events from skyboxes while everyone else sits in the stands. They go to different schools. They eat different food. They ski on private mountains with people very much like themselves. Suddenly, America has a new class system. And the other development is that the Democratic Party no longer represents the working class. Since the Clinton administration, the Democratic Party has become the party of investors, of managers, of welfare recipients, and of the ruling class. We've also had unlimited immigration. The Democratic Party used to be, because they were a party of the working class, they used to be against unlimited immigration. Now they've completely flipped. Democrats know that immigrants vote overwhelmingly for them. So mass immigration is the most effective possible electoral strategy. You don't have to convince or serve voters. You can just import them. We've had foolish wars and nation building. One of the major lessons our elites seem to derive from 9/11 is that the best way to fight Islamic terror is to welcome huge number of immigrants from places known for Islamic extremism. Pretty much every foreign policy decision in recent years has been a disaster. Yet elite enthusiasm for nation building and pointless wars continues unabated. Our leaders still seem more committed to liberating Syrian towns from some armed group or other than to fixing rotting suburbs in Akron. Our leaders seem less interested than ever in the country they actually govern. We've had a drug and opioid epidemic. From 1999 to 2016, the death rate from opioid drugs has risen more than 400%. Drug overdoses are killing more Americans every year than died during the entire Vietnam War. Outside the richest cities, life expectancy is falling for the first time in American history due to a combination of drug overdoses and suicides. In a healthy society, decades of obvious failures by elites would force a change of ideas or a change of leadership. Neither has happened. The same class of lawmakers, journalists, and business chieftains holds power, despite their dismal record. America now has not only one of the least impressive ruling classes in history, but also the least self-aware. They have no idea how bad they are. There's a reason for that. The path to the American elite has been marked for decades. Perform well on standardized tests, win admission to an elite school, enter one of a handful of elite professions, settle in a handful of elite zip codes, marry a fellow elite, and reproduce. Repeat that cycle for a couple of generations, and you wind up with a ruling class so insulated from the country it rules that failure goes unnoticed. A small group of people accumulates unimaginable wealth while the rest of the country becomes a desiccated husk. Yet everything seems fine. Our ruling class doesn't care, not simply about American citizens, but about the future of the country itself. Our leaders understood Trump's election as a direct challenge to their power. They've been fretting about his authoritarian tendencies ever since. Because they lack self-awareness, they don't perceive this as projection. They can't see that they're actually talking about themselves. Let's say you were an authoritarian who sought to weaken American democracy. How would you go about doing that? You'd probably start by trying to control what people say and think. If citizens dissented from the mandated orthodoxy or dared to consider unauthorized ideas, you'd hurt them. You'd shame them on social media. You'd shut them down in public. You'd get them fired from their jobs. You'd make sure everyone was afraid to disagree with you. After that, you'd work to disarm the population. You'd take the guns away. That way, they would be entirely dependent on you for safety, not to mention unable to resist your plans for them. Then, just to make sure you quelled all opposition, you'd systematically target any institution that might oppose or put brakes on your power. You'd be especially concerned about churches, the family, and independent businesses. You'd be sure to undermine and crush those using laws and relentless propaganda. If, despite all this, election results still didn't go your way, you'd use an unelected bureaucracy to neuter any leader you hadn't handpicked yourself. But you'd be shaken by an election like that. You would resolve never to allow one again. To make sure of that, you'd work tirelessly to replace the old and ungrateful population with a new and more obedient one. That's what you do. Sound familiar? For all of his many faults, Donald Trump isn't doing that. Our ruling class is.
Let me talk a little bit more about the decline of the middle class. This is a big concern with us on the podcast, and we've talked about it quite a bit because it leads to income inequality. And that income inequality creates the two classes of people. And this has usually been a Democrat argument. Now it's a conservative argument. The Democrats are the party of rich elites. And I'm going to repeat some statistics that Vadim has already shared with us, but let's do it again. Go back to 1970. When 60% of people identified as middle class. By 2015, the middle class was less than 50%. So we have more identifying now as being poor or rich, not middle class. We have a new class system.
It's a Latin American model.
It is. It's a third world model where you have elites in the capitals of the provinces and the capital of the government, and they go to the same schools, they frequent the same cocktail parties, they lead to jobs in the knowledge sector and that people don't have a chance. It's a new class system. Democrats used to run on this, but now they run on race or gender, abortion, climate change, not economic arguments that people really care about, not pocketbook issues.
They run and talk about issues that really don't mean a whole lot to an average person.
And while they do that, jobs disappear. 20 million low-skilled jobs have disappeared over the years. Now, let's talk about more about the health pandemic. And hopefully we're going to have an episode on the podcast about the health pandemic from methamphetamine and fentanyl. From 1999 to 2016, opioid drug deaths rose more than 400%. That's what Vadim already said. And I want to punch that point home. Previously, the government fought hard against AIDS, for example, against health pandemics. But why aren't they fighting against fentanyl and meth in the same way? You get monkeypox arguments and worries about that when we're not talking about all the fentanyl that's coming in across the southern border.
So how do you explain that? From 99 to 2016, the death rate from opioid drugs has risen by more than 400%. Number one, why is this happening? And number two, why aren't the elites doing anything about it?
It's not happening to the elites. It's happening to the lower classes and the hinterlands, where elites are not populated.
Okay, so is it the fact that they don't know about it, or it doesn't affect them, and so it's out of their mind?
It's out of their mind. They don't see it as much as West Virginia or Ohio or Kansas or Oklahoma. Okay. These kinds of states that are flyover states that the elites don't have any part of.
I bet it had something to do with the decline of the middle class. The increase in death rate from opioid drugs is correlated with the decline in the middle class.
I would say that. I think that we would have to, test for other factors,
right,
and control for other.
I haven't done the research, but my guess is it's probably there's a reason. That's when China came into WTO around that time
during the Clinton administration.
So late 90s, early 2000. Mm-hmm. I mean, because in 99 the economy was still pretty good, right?
There was a recession in 2000, 2001.
Yeah, there's a recession in 2000.
And after 9/11, the market crashed.
But my point is, this was like way before the financial crisis. So it's interesting to me that it started then. It probably has something to do with the loss of manufacturing and the decline of the middle class.
Correct. All things equal. Okay. Correlation.
Correct. Go ahead.
The two parties used to be separated by their views on economics and finance. Those were the good old days when parties sparred over tax rates and trade policy, how labor unions were treated or not treated, the minimum wage, raising that or keeping it the same. And then conservatives championed free markets. The liberals were against free markets. It made a lot more sense in the days before we have identity politics and other issues. Democrats supported labor unions generally, and Republicans wanted right to work. And then we found out that children were not doing better than their parents financially. Are they doing better than their parents financially? No. So the Democrats, as Vadim said, become the party of the rich. In 2016, 8 of America's 10 most rich counties voted for Hillary Clinton. Take Fairfield County, Connecticut, where all the hedge funds are. Hillary won that county by 20%. Aspen, Colorado, a playground for the rich. Aspen went for Hillary 45 points over Trump. In Manhattan, Trump won less than 10% of the vote. In D.C., where we are, 4%, 96-4 from the elites in D.C.
Trump got less vote in D.C. than a third-party candidate.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And then money raising. Hillary outraised Trump 20-1. Among billionaires. Hedge fund owners and banksters and employees from hedge funds and investment banks donated almost $28 million to Hillary. And then big tech. The employees for big tech companies donated to Hillary 60-1.
Right. So how do you explain that shift in the Democratic Party? What happened and why?
Well, they cobbled together these identity politics. So you have the elites from various industries. Corporations became more woke. You have academia, which has always been liberal. You have the cultural producers in Los Angeles and actors and actresses and directors and producers who have become more liberal over time. And so the Democrat Party said, you know what, we're going to take minorities, for example, and we're going to hold this coalition together. That's how Obama did it. He started this coalition. Hillary came and she said, you know what, I'm not going to even try with the upper Midwest and the Rust Belt. I'm not going to try for certain I'm just going to do what Obama did. And she didn't have the charisma or the appeal. So what we have with the Democrats is holding together this coalition of elites and people who don't have anything to do with what the working man and the working woman want to hear from their politicians.
Here's kind of my thesis, right? Traditionally, why were rich people Republicans? Because of tax cuts, would you say?
I think the parties kind of aligned themselves under, like we said before, economic issues. And so Republicans believed in trickle-down theory, tax cuts.
They believe that business is good, markets are good.
The free market will straighten everything out.
Less regulations. So that's what appealed to businessmen, historically, to the Republican Party. So I'm just trying to understand, I'm trying to nail this phenomena. Why did rich people switch to the Democratic Party?
Yeah,
I'm trying to succinctly explain it in one sentence, but I think you can't. I think there's probably a combination of things.
Do they believe they're being liked more or loved more?
Tucker makes this point in the book. I think it's important to understand because I've been wondering about this for a while now.
How did it flip? How did working class become more conservative? People in Kansas, for example.
Right.
There's a book on that. It's like, why do people in Kansas vote conservative?
What's the thesis of the book? I haven't read it, but
it's flipped. Just what you're saying.
What's the matter in Kansas? Is that it came out mid-2000s or something?
Yeah. Why is the working class voting conservative and Republican?
Why did all these working class people vote for Bush in the 2000s? But coming back to the Democratic Party, so this is kind of interesting to me. And Tucker kind of gets to this in his book. Again, guys, you got to read this book. If you want to understand these macro transformational issues, the realignment of American politics, you guys got to read this book. It's not that long of a book. You can read it probably in one sitting. I've read it twice now. But let me just kind of try to nail this down. And this is fascinating to me. Like somebody who likes looking at the macro issues and understanding why change and transformation happens. Here's what Tucker says in the book. Traditionally, liberals were the counterculture. They were against the so-called man. Baby boomers and the 60s liberals, they grew up and became the elite. So that's point number one. Point number two is new kinds of business people have emerged in the last 20 years since the tech boom of the 90s. And that's younger, more liberal cultural people who are naturally more receptive to the Democratic Party. Think of like a tech founder who is 25 years old, might have an exit, who becomes super wealthy. The baby boomers and the 60s liberals became the elite. Money changes a person's mindset. You become what you railed against, 20 years earlier.
Let's talk about the labor movement. And historically, Democrats have always been pro-labor. But if you look at it now, why aren't Democrats riled up about labor practices overseas, particularly with Apple and Foxconn and China? I mean, this is an issue that if you're so worried about events around the globe, you should be worried about how workers are treated at Foxconn. They make less than $2 an hour, if that. They're forced to work 24 hours a day. They're sometimes beaten. They've tried to commit suicide, even mass suicide together. So this is a reason why, people love their iPhones. I don't have an iPhone. I have a Samsung, by the way. I protest against Apple for various reasons other than workers. But I find this fascinating that the left is not concerned about Apple. And Apple says all the right things. They're woke and they talk about different rights for minorities and for LGBTQ, but they are given a pass on their labor practices. So you would think the Democrat Party and liberals would be more concerned about labor practices of Apple, but they're not. There was a book in 1974.
Yeah. Let me just read that quote.
Okay, go ahead.
Let me read this quote from Tucker's book because it's kind of fascinating. It's so good. I not only highlighted it, but I underlined it. Corporations embrace a progressive agenda that from an accounting perspective costs them nothing. In exchange, they get to maintain the economic status quo that has made them billions. The company's affluent customers get to imagine they're fighting the power by purchasing the products, even as they make a tiny group of people richer and more powerful. There's never been a more brilliant marketing strategy.
Yes, market capitalism and progressive social value.
And listen to our episode on woke capitalism. I think that was episode 4. Go back and listen to that because we touch in detail on the corporate America's embrace of all these progressive social values.
In depth. We can look at Facebook suppressing right-leaning stories from news feeds. We can look at all the different ways that corporations try to squelch free speech. But yeah, that shift from market capitalism
To woke
and the corporation. I worked on Capitol Hill, and I can talk to you offline about how many people from corporations would come into our office asking for relief in regulations and tax policy. But at the same time, they're woke and they're against Republicans.
Right.
And so the Republicans are saying, we have been for corporations and business and industry since the early 20th century. And now you say that we're the evil ones, that we are the ones, we've helped you. And, so a lot of congressional members are looking at corporations and saying, we helped you over the last 30, 40, 50 years, and you're turning on us. Why is that? But going back to the way liberals and the Democrat Party viewed labor, there's a book in 1974 by a socialist by the name of Studs Terkel. And Studs Terkel was a early investigative reporter that tried to find problems in the workplace. And he talked about working people and the dignity of work. This is for the blue collar folks, the middle class. And liberals embraced this book. And I read it. It was mainly a book about photography. And what Studs Terkel did, he just went around to various occupations around the country, many of them blue collar, middle class, and he interviewed them. And he just said, hey, what do you do every day? What do you like about your job? What do you not like about your job? And so the left embraced this. They said, this is what the Democrat Party is about. We're for the little guy. We're for the people who couldn't make it without a social and welfare policy. When I was in high school, I read a book on autobiography about Willie Mays, the Hall of Fame baseball player, center fielder for the Giants. And he talked about politics. And he said, the reason I'm a Democrat is because the Democrats can step in and help people faster than the free market can work. So the Democrats used to be associated with stepping into that void where the middle class couldn't help themselves due to whatever reason, maybe bad luck, maybe health problems, maybe lack of skills.
Temporary relief.
Temporary relief to help
to get to that next job.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good.
And now it's changed. It's flipped.
But, for every power, you need a countervailing power, as we covered last week on the Truth Caviar show. Last week, we covered the rise of the managerial elite and the administrative state. Go back and listen to that episode as well, because it's all related, right? We cover all these episodes because we want to understand these big ideas.
We connect the dots.
Right? For every power, you need a countervailing power that keeps that power in check. Right? And that's what our founders and fathers understood. Checks and balances, separation of powers.
Yes.
That's the point that Tucker makes in the book. No matter how much he hated the Democratic Party, he understood that they played an important role in our society to keep the corporate and the business sector in check so they don't get too powerful. And also, lift up the dignity of working people, of labor. And that's gone now because the Democratic Party has basically joined the Republicans in helping, the elites.
Talk about a very effective labor union and labor movement was Cesar Chavez. And Cesar Chavez, rightly celebrated by the left, and many streets and community centers and buildings are named after Cesar Chavez, a wonderful man. But Cesar Chavez was against illegal immigration. Now, we haven't talked a lot about illegal immigration yet, but we're starting to connect these dots and looking at how the left originally viewed, and Cesar Chavez was one, that illegal immigration would destroy the middle class because it would reduce wages and take jobs. That was, again, an economic pro-middle class, lower middle class argument against illegal immigration.
Business people wanted more illegal immigration. Both legal and illegal immigrants traditionally work for less. They're willing to work for less. Like you live in Caracas and you're got nothing. If you're making $10 an hour for a job that hiring in America might require paying 20, relative to where they're from, $10 an hour job allows them to live a much better life than what they're used to in Caracas. Let me just read this quote from Tucker. This kind of summarizes what we just talked about here. The disaster began when almost everyone in power joined the same team. You used to hear debates between Republicans and Democrats. liberals and conservatives, on issues that matter to the rest of the country. That's over. Our public debates are mostly symbolic. They are sideshows designed to divert attention from the fact that those who make the essential decisions about the economy and the government and war have reached consensus on the fundamentals. They agree with each other. They just don't agree with the population they govern. Left and right are no longer meaningful categories in America. The rift is between those who benefit from the status quo and those who don't. That's rarely acknowledged in public, which is convenient for those who are benefiting. The people in charge are free to pursue policies that are disconnected from the public good, but that have, not coincidentally, made them richer, more powerful, and much more self-satisfied, but not more impressive. Our leaders are fools, unaware that they're captains of a sinking ship.
And I want to take it back to immigration, though, a little bit more, because I think it's an important shift in the Democrat Party. And once again, just so you know, we on this podcast are very pro-immigration. Vadim is an immigrant.
Yep.
My wife happens to be a minority. She's Hispanic. And so we believe that immigrants can really make a difference in this country, and they come here for the American dream.
Right.
And you're seeing more immigrants that are becoming part of the Republican Party. But there was a shift because the elites in the Democrat Party were originally against illegal and legal immigration.
Because they represented the working class.
Yeah, Joe Biden introduced legislation to curb immigration from Vietnam. Bill Clinton against illegal immigration. He sounded a lot like a Republican.
Barbara
nowadays.
Jordan, right?
Barbara Jordan, a big Democrat.
Yep.
She was against illegal immigration.
She served as his immigration point person or something like that, right?
She headed up a commission. They filed a report.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
And in 2000, the Democrat platform was against illegal immigration. But in 2004, Democrats reversed. And this is a mystery to me. They took a 180 and they supported amnesty. Why is that the case? By 2016, Democrats wanted all illegal immigrants to become legal citizens.
Well, J.D. Vance, who's running for Senate in Ohio, he once gave an interview and he told a story. So he goes to the swanky dinner, where all the elites are and some kind of elite gathering. And he's sitting next to some businessman. I think he owns a hotel or something. And he says, "I hate Trump." J.D. Vance, can you explain? Why do you hate Trump? This is a direct quote from J.D. This hotel person said, "Well, there's not enough illegal immigrants now, and I actually have to hire an American."
Whoa.
A lot of Americans for the jobs, for cleaning staff or whatever.
Wow.
So he's selling out your countrymen. And so that's just crystallizes how selfish they really are. Let me read this other quote that goes into woke capitalism. This is kind of interesting. "The marriage of market capitalism to progressive social values may be the most destructive combination in American economic history. Someone needs to protect workers from the terrifying power of market forces, which tend to accelerate change to intolerable levels and crush the weak. For generations, labor unions filled that role.
Yes.
That's over. Left and right now agree that a corporation's only real responsibility is to its shareholder. Companies can now mistreat their employees or contractors, but for the price of installing transgender bathrooms, they buy a pass. We can rip people off, we can use slave labor in China, but embracing these progressive values, that's the price we pay to continue doing business as usual. Mm-hmm. Shareholders win, workers lose. Bowing to the diversity agenda is a lot cheaper than raising wages."
Yeah, that's amazing. And also, all of this, and Tucker does a good job of connecting the dots once again.
Exactly.
All of this leads to segregation. Now, in the 60s and the 50s, we know in the civil rights movement that segregation is wrong. We fought against segregation. There's a civil rights movement for a reason, and those reasons were good. But now we still have segregation between white elites and African Americans and Hispanics. So we have rich people living in white communities, but preaching to you about why it's important to honor minorities. And so you have Obama living in this part of D.C. There's a part of Washington, D.C. that is so ultra rich and exclusive that you wouldn't believe it. It's about 4%, almost all white. I would say the people that live there that are not white are probably serving as chauffeurs or maids or groundskeepers. But President Obama lives in this section of D.C. It's called Calamara, and it's almost all white. His house cost about $2 million. It's probably gated.
Mm-hmm. Probably has a fence around it.
Sure. And then you have Michael Bloomberg, who's always lecturing us about ESG and being woke. He lives in a lily white zip code. You have rich areas with segregated schools with mostly white students, which is something that we always fought against. The Democrats always fought against segregation. You have the left-wing Maxine Waters. Her home is in an area that is only 6% African American. And so this has got to be frustrating to liberals, but they don't talk about it. It's frustrating to conservatives, and conservatives talk about this, but the left totally misses the idea that their section of people, their elite group, lives in segregated communities.
Yes. Going back to Obama. So Obama has a house in Calamara, right?
Yes.
Got a house in Martha's Vineyard.
Oh, I forgot about that house.
And he's got a house in Hawaii. He's got 3 houses, all in like 99% white people living in those neighborhoods.
Elite communities.
Yeah, elite communities, right. And Tucker makes this point in the book. People who preach about diversity don't actually want to live in diverse places. They don't want diversity around them.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Diversity for me, but not for thee.
Exactly.
Yeah. So let's talk about foreign policy.
Yeah, go ahead.
So foreign policy, during the Cold War, Republicans were known as being the hawks, being strong against communism, willing to roll back communism. And then also after the War on Terror, after 9/11 rather, that you had conservatives who were viewing themselves as tough on terrorism and willing to do incursions to defeat people that they didn't like. And all of these types of strong peace through strength foreign policy was associated with conservatives and Republicans. And one of the things Republicans used to run on foreign policy and just say to everybody, they're weak on communism. The Democrats are weak on foreign policy. They're for peace. They're for denuclearization, all of these types of issues. Well, that's kind of flipped because of Donald Trump. Donald Trump came in and said Iraq war was wrong. He said, let's get out of Afghanistan. Let's not get into these endless wars. So the Republicans now are like libertarians. They've taken the libertarian view as to focus on America and American problems and not get entangled in foreign alliances or other types of adventures in foreign policy. And that's all because of Donald Trump.
Right. Let me go back a little bit to the economics again, because I think this is important.
Very much.
You mentioned about segregation. I think what you really meant, not racial segregation, but stratification. Right, of people, creating a 2-class system, the elites and everybody else.
But of course, they call us racists who are from the middle of the country.
Right. That's just a distraction. Don't look at economics, look at racism, look at, all of these phantom issues. This 2-class caste system, right? This caste system that we have, where a very small number of people at the top reap all the rewards in the economy. What does that mean for our democracy? And connect that to the political. So when you have a whole bunch of people who feel like the system is rigged, that their children will not have as good a life as them, it creates volatility. People who have nothing to lose are very dangerous. Taken to its logical extreme, you have 2 choices. Either you have a revolution. Last week we talked about counter-revolution from below, the populist revolution. The elites have 2 choices. Either they're going to be overtaken by the populists, or they have to suppress the populists. They have to remove democracy and become authoritarian, totalitarian.
This is almost a Marxist argument.
Exactly. I just want to read this quote because I think it's kind of important. Our ruling class doesn't care, not simply about American citizen, but about the future of the country itself. They view America the way a private equity firm sizes up an aging industrial conglomerate.
Interesting point.
As something outdated they can profit from. When it fails, they're gone. They've got money offshore and foreign passports at home. Our rulers have no intention of staying for the finale. Countries can survive war and famines and disease. They cannot survive leaders who despise their own people. Increasingly, our leaders work against the public's interests. They view the concerns of middle-class America as superstitious and backward. They fantasize about replacing Americans who live here with their antiquated attitudes and seemingly intractable problems with a new population of more pliant immigrants. Increasingly, Americans have become to understand this, and they resent it. Historically, rulers derive legitimacy from one of two sources, God or voters. Rulers are in charge either because they claim some higher power put them there or because a majority of people voted for them. Both systems have been tried for centuries. Both can work. The one system that absolutely does not work and will never is ersatz democracy. If you tell people they're in charge, but then act as if they're not, you will infuriate them. It's too dishonest. They'll go crazy. Oligarchies posing as democracies will always be overthrown in the end.
We're getting close to what the Soviet Union went through in the 80s and the early 90s, and it was overthrown and disintegrated because you had a group of elites at the top who did not care about the masses, which was against Marxist ideology. But the Soviets knew, and many of the reformers, such as Gorbachev and his crew, they knew that the days were numbered. They thought that they could change communism and make it better, but it already lost. So the elites, if you look at the Soviet Union, had all the best jobs. They had all the good party positions. Their kids went to elite schools. They had apartments and that were in nice areas of Moscow and Petersburg. And so we're getting to that point where the elites have taken charge so much, and we're losing the idea, the identity of the United States of America, where you had social mobility, economic mobility. You could start at the bottom, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, start a small business, work in an assembly line and make a good wage, and then send your kids to school and they would have a better life than you.
That's the American dream.
American dream.
Do you remember that movie with Michael J. Fox called The Secret of My Success?
Yes, I do.
So I just watched it last week, and I watched it like 2 million times. I've seen it a lot. And I love that movie. A lot of exaggeration there, so it's not it's Hollywood. I'm not sure if in today's America, somebody from like a farm in Kansas can come to a big city like New York and make it. I don't know if that path is available today. What do you think?
Michael J. Fox in the movie was trying to make it in corporate America, and he was working in the mailroom.
Yeah, and he would change identities.
And he would change identities. He would act like he was part of the corporate ruling class, and he would change clothes in the elevator.
I mean, there's a lot of fake things there because he delivers mail, and like nobody remembers him, nobody recognizes him, that no executive says, hey guy, I think I've seen you before. You know what I mean? Remember that scene where they're in the conference room and then his uncle who hired him comes in and pretends he has a nosebleed, and the uncle got stupid. He can't really tell that it's his nephew. There's a lot of dramatization,
Sure.
for entertainment value. But I love that movie because it's very inspirational. It's everything that was good about the 80s, right?
Yeah.
About America and living the American dream and having dreams. And
if you worked hard and pulled yourselves up, you could accomplish anything.
Yep.
And we don't have that as much anymore. And that's why we're worried about this stratification and caste system between the rich and the poor and the shrinking middle class.
So Brent, I have a question for you. Going back to foreign policy, let's talk about neoconservatism. It's not really clear to me. What is neoconservatism? How would you define neoconservatism?
This was the belief of that Trotskyism, socialism, and the Liberal Democrat Party left certain members of the party. And it had to do with liberals and the left being soft on communism. So you had a group of people who were conservative Democrats, but identified with the Democrats on social policy and other types of domestic policy. So they were in favor of making the social and welfare state improving for people. So they believed in the financial aspects of being a Democrat. However, on foreign policy against the Soviet Union, they were mad because liberals were considered weak against communism. So these people left the Democrat Party and they started calling themselves neoconservatives, led by Irving Kristol, who is Bill Kristol. Neo, meaning new.
New conservatism.
And Irving Kristol was really big on this. He was at AEI in Washington, D.C. He's the father of Bill Kristol.
Right.
And they became known as the ones that are going to roll back communism. They came up with an unholy alliance with the Republicans. So these were former Democrats that kind of became Republicans. And they started supporting the elimination of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. This was the mid to late 90s.
Their central belief is what? America must be strong militarily, right?
Strong militarily, but still keep the welfare state. So they're still Democrats on domestic policy.
So they're liberal on domestic policy and hawks on foreign policy.
Hawks in terms of regime change.
Okay. I don't think Reagan was for regime change. Right?
Only against the Soviet Union.
Right. But he did it diplomatically. He didn't do it militarily. If he had to, he would have used force.
There were neoconservatives in his administration, though.
Okay, I see. I think the main takeaway to me in the current context is that neoconservatives, they really are not conservatives. They're essentially liberals on domestic issues.
Policy, yes.
So that kind of explains to me they were anti-Trump, like Crystal and all these people, Cheney's, because he criticized their foreign policy.
He criticized the war in Iraq and the regime change against Saddam Hussein.
Right.
So Bill Kristol got really mad at that.
They have no loyalty to the Republican Party, which explains Liz Cheney to me.
Only as a means to get into power.
As long as they get power, as long as they making dough,
get good jobs in the administration,
get the job, have some influence, that's all they care about. Okay, so that kind of explains to me the Liz Cheney. So they swing where the wind is blowing. Oh, I'm going to be a Republican this decade, and then next decade, I don't like what Republican gets into office. I'm going to be essentially a Democrat.
Or never Trumper.
Right, exactly. So that explains kind of the never Trump movement. But I have a question for you, Brent. When it comes to wars and regime change and nation building, Democrats are not that much different from Republicans these days, right?
Well, now you said it yourself. Go back to the Vietnam War. The liberals were the renegades and the mavericks against what the man was saying about the Vietnam War.
Correct.
They were the ones who said, no, the government is telling us lies about the Vietnam War.
Which they were.
So we are going to be identified with a new left that believed in socialism and Marxism, but also peace, and left of center in terms of not supporting real robust responses to communism.
Okay.
So it was Reagan that came in and said, there was détente with Henry Kissinger and Nixon. Right. And the Reagan people moved away from that. They said, no, we're not going to live with communism. We're going to defeat communism. We're going to do peace through strength, but we're going to do it in a way that undermines communism and leads to the West winning the Cold War.
Nixon and Ford, they weren't that hawkish, right?
No, not really. Nixon, went to China, as you know, and tried to do a rapprochement diplomatically with the Chinese, and he was successful to a certain extent. Ford was a moderate, and Ford kind of wanted to change the way that people viewed the government after Vietnam. So he was trying to do a return to normalcy. Mm-hmm. It's interesting that Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld worked for Ford, and they were moderate back then, but Cheney and Rumsfeld became extremists in terms of regime change in Iraq. And so you see these people in the Republican Party kind of switch back and forth, and Reagan decided to roll back communism. He was a real hardliner, although he changed in his second term, and he was more for peace with the Soviet Union. And so he worked on diplomacy.
But my point is, prior to Reagan, Republicans weren't more hawkish than Democrats, right?
I would argue they were. They were isolationists during World War II.
LBJ was a hawk, right? Would you say LBJ was a hawk?
More because he did not want to be the president who lost a war. Remember, we had won wars in the 20th century.
Right.
So LBJ's pressure was he cannot lose the war in Vietnam by all means. It would end his presidency.
Do you think Kennedy was more hawkish than Eisenhower?
I think they were very similar in terms of they had different approaches to the Cold War in terms of nuclear engagement. And Kennedy wanted to work with Latin America and make sure that Latin Americans were not becoming communist. And Ike was against defense spending. Ike really believed more in nuclear.
Complex.
Yeah, he coined the military-industrial complex. He wanted to reduce the way the military
even though he was a general.
Yeah, but he believed in nuclear war weapons.
My point is, before the Vietnam War, the parties were very similar on foreign policy. Is that a fair statement?
I would say every president had a different way of dealing with the Soviets during the Cold War. Okay. And the pendulum kind of swung depending on who was in power. And we had massive retaliation. We had flexible response. We had different ways to go against the Soviets.
Right.
But Reagan was the first one who said, we can win this.
Let me ask you this. Harry Truman was more hawkish than Eisenhower. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, in terms of using nuclear weapons. Yeah, of course.
Okay. Korea?
Started under Truman.
He used the atomic bomb.
And Eisenhower wanted us out of Korea.
Right. I'm not a historian, but it seems to me that prior to Vietnam, Democrats were more hawkish than Republicans.
Yeah, you could argue that. The way I would explain the hawkish dovishness was that each president during the Cold War wanted to be different than the previous presidents. So they had different ways to approach the Cold War. So that's what you need to take away from this.
What was the Truman Doctrine? Stop communism at any cost?
Stop at all costs. Freedom at any cost.
Freedom at any cost, right?
Yeah.
The New Left took over the Democratic Party during Vietnam. And then after Vietnam, they became more dovish.
And they went to colleges and universities, became professors,
right,
and indoctrinated people into the left.
Why did they go to colleges? Because they thought that's how they can affect change, right?
Right. That's what they learned. That's what they were socialized into social change.
Learn from whom?
Well, they were all students during the Vietnam War. Yeah, they were 18 to 22.
They're like, we need to change the system.
We need to change the system, and I'm going to stay in college because I like doing, I like teaching because I can indoctrinate students into the new left.
Right. We should probably have an episode on talk about more detail about that whole Herbert Marcuse and some of these other intellectuals that sort of influenced the new left. The 70s, right, with George McGovern and then Jimmy Carter was sort of the low point of Democratic foreign policy.
I would say so, especially under Carter.
I don't think Nixon was all that hawkish. He wasn't a dove, but he wasn't as hawkish as Reagan.
It was called détente,
right?
Meaning you could live with the Soviet Union. You could work with the Soviet Union.
Right.
You could contain the Soviet Union. You could use the Chinese to play off the Soviet Union. And Reagan argued against this. He said, "No, we're giving up. We're capitulating. We should work on winning the Cold War."
Right. What was Goldwater's opinion?
Libertarian.
Goldwater was a libertarian.
I think so in terms of...
I think Reagan got a lot of his ideas. He was influenced by Goldwater. Because remember, he gave that speech on the eve of the 1964 election, the time for choosing.
Yeah, time for choosing.
So I think Reagan...
Bold colors instead of pastels.
Right. Nixon is more Eisenhower, I think. Not weak, but also not as hawkish as Reagan.
Going back to the New Left and people who are protesting against the Vietnam War, well, the protest movement started with the free speech movement. Mm-hmm. And so Democrats historically have been pro-free speech because of the war and pro-First Amendment because of freedom of assembly. And the ACLU was historically associated with Democrats. So what do we have now? We have 52% of Democrats do not believe in free speech. Now it's flipped. Now the Republican Party is the party of free speech. And now it's believed that conservatives are being silenced. The ACLU was part of the Democrat Party pretty much.
And they started when? Like in the early 20th century, right?
Mm-hmm. They defended everybody, KKK. Well,
it originally started because they defended, I think it was somebody because Woodrow Wilson wanted to prosecute somebody for distributing pamphlets.
Oh, in World War I.
During World War I. Uh-huh. We should probably talk about Woodrow Wilson in more detail on future episodes because I think he's an interesting character in American history. Why was there a free speech movement in the 60s? What were they protesting? Who tried to curtail their free speech?
Well, the college administration at UC Berkeley was, and Reagan was the governor at that point, they were considered...
I think it started in 64 before Reagan.
Before Reagan, okay. Yeah. I apologize for that. But the free speech movement was against the administrative people at colleges and universities who were saying that, hey, you need to go to class. This is not working out. You can't walk out of class and you can't damage property. And so the free speech movement started off in the early 60s at Berkeley. And then it transformed itself into anti-war against Vietnam. I mean, they felt like they were being trampled upon. Their rights were being trampled upon as students. Well, I think the important point is that it's flipped. That now we have Democrats who believe that free speech leads to hate speech. And Tucker Carlson devotes a large part of his book.
Yeah, the left is no longer for free speech. They used to be for free speech.
So if you're considered pro-Israel, for example, you can be shouted down.
It's because those people who were in the counterculture are now in the establishment. The roles have flipped, if you will, right? And so basically what they did is they became the power. Liberals became the powerful, and they lift up the ladder behind them, and they said, hey, you can't talk. We're in charge now. That's really what happened.
Another thing Tucker talks about is gender and how the parties have aligned themselves around gender, especially women who are single who tend to vote Democrat, probably because of abortion, but they're a little more left of center on domestic policy. And then you have white males. And you have, more specifically, white males with no college degree, high school educated white males. And these people are seen as oppressors and Trump voters. And the elites look down on white males as the oppressors.
Right.
But when you look and you dive down into the statistics, the demography of statistics with white males, you notice that it's the white males that are really suffering. Life expectancy for white males has gone down. Wages have declined for white males. Angry white males are disparaged in the media. Men live less long than women. 77% of suicides are committed by men. More than 90% of prison inmates are men. 7 million men between 25 and 54 do not have jobs. Working class male jobs, if they're lucky to have one, could be eliminated by automation.
Yeah.
So gender, we have a gender problem in this country in terms of politics, partisan politics.
Let me go back to foreign policy and war, because I think this is instructive. Let me read Tucker again, because this is kind of important. For the first time in living memory, Democrats in Washington were every bit as hawkish as Republicans. The alignment was complete. How did that happen? The first step for Democrats was embracing violence as a tool of positive social change. In 1965, liberals viewed the bombing of North Vietnam as a moral atrocity. 30 years later, they applauded Bill Clinton's bombing of Bosnia as a means of protecting the rights of vulnerable minority group.
And Serbia, too, in 1999.
The local Muslim population. Liberals discovered that war was an expedient form of social engineering, not to mention politically popular. The practical effects of the policies are less interesting to policymakers in Washington than the spirit in which they're intended. Intent is what matters. The second driving force was a change in leadership in America's leading institutions. Liberal skepticism of the Vietnam War was inseparable from a generalized suspicion of the establishment. The left distrusted the government's rhetoric and goals in the Vietnam War.
That's true.
Because the left distrusted the government itself. Liberals knew powerful people were happy to lie to them. Liberals now control those elite institutions. They no longer distrust power. They wield it.
Well, I think I would disagree with some of Tucker's and other America Firsters foreign policy. I think there are times where the United States needs to be the leader of the free world, not necessarily the policeman or 911 center of the free world, but there's sometimes we do have to step up and we have to use our military might and our soft power and hard power to rise up against injustices. And so I happen to believe that arming Ukraine is something to do. And Tucker is against that. And he's a rebel against that. Now, one thing that we're not doing in Ukraine with all this military assistance that we're giving the Ukrainians is there's not a lot of oversight over, we need an inspector general. And Rand Paul has talked about this. We need somebody to be the auditor of all of this money and arms that are going to Ukraine, because we don't know if it's going in the right place. We don't know if people are stealing it. We don't know if people are skimming from it. We don't know if it's getting to the people where it's supposed to get. And so Tucker has talked about this, but I disagree with the America Firsters sometimes on foreign policy. I'm more of a Reagan conservative, where Reagan believed that there are different times where you could intervene and times that you did not intervene. And this had to do with geography.
Well, just because you could doesn't mean you
it's
should.
called conservative internationalism and using prudence with American military might.
Let's say something happens in France tomorrow.
Should we intervene? We should only intervene if it's a direct threat to America's national security.
That's true. And you can give Trump credit for using special forces and drones and special operations forces to do minimal strikes and targeted assassinations. And so I think this has been really effective. I think Trump figured out that he could use drones and special operations forces like Obama. Obama used drones a lot. But the real problem, and I would agree with the America Firsters and people who are against the endless wars. I was against staying in Afghanistan for long. I was a staff person who on a campaign for Congress in 2010. And he was a Republican, and I convinced him to be against the war in Afghanistan. And this was a very unorthodox idea, but I thought the war in Afghanistan, Obama thought it was the right war. I didn't think it was the right war because it didn't have a lot of strategic values and strategic points that would lead to American soft power and hard power being increased in Afghanistan. I didn't think there was a hope for democracy. I didn't think the Afghans had a culture for instigating democracy. They had some elections, but you could argue, and I thought there was a lot of money wasted in rebuilding. So we did nation building in Afghanistan. So I would agree with the endless war America firsters on Afghanistan. I think we should have been out of Afghanistan back in 2010. I don't think it was a winnable war.
Tucker has a hostility to private equity. He talks about it a lot on his show or in his books. The question that I have is, how does private equity work? What is private equity and how does it work? So the idea is what? Like you have a struggling corporation, private equity buys the corporation, and then what? They lay off all the people, bring up the value of
They cut costs.
They cut costs. Okay, go ahead, explain how that works.
Well, you know what a venture capital fund is?
Yes.
So you start off with a general partnership. You have general partners in a fund, and then you try to add limited partners, and those are the folks that give you money for the fund, and then you invest the fund. Well, private equity funds operate in similar ways. So the important part about a private equity fund is those that have the fund do a fee structure called 2 and 10. So they get 2% of the operating funds to run the fund each year, and then they get 10% of the profits that they do for private equity. Right. And so what happens, and Mitt Romney was a private equity guy, and and so these are turnaround people. So they leverage the money to buy a company through borrowing.
So they buy a company. That supposedly is doing bad financially.
And then they get it for a discount, and you're correct that they turn it around. And a lot of this has to do with cost cutting.
Okay.
So they may eliminate jobs. They may outsource jobs. To China to save money. And
so
then
you cut costs.
And these are elitists. Remember, they're coming from Harvard Business School. They're coming from Stanford Business School. They're coming from Northwestern. All the top business schools. They want to go into private equity because it's kind of like a hedge fund and it's kind of like venture capital. It's more like venture capital because you're investing in a company. But you're correct where you do a turnaround, you build up the company, you sell it, and the profits, you get a percentage of the profits. So that's the idea.
So is it always the case that they cut costs? Or could you raise the value of the company without cutting costs? I mean, I guess it's probably some combination.
Yeah, you're trying to get more efficiencies. So you may reorganize and get a new CEO, get new leadership.
So you buy a company for value X.
Low market value.
Below market value.
Below book value.
Because it's doing bad financially. So you go to the owner and say, hey, I'm willing to give you X for your company. Just walk away, no harm, no foul.
Or I'm going to invest in it. Like a venture capital. So in turn for equity.
And then they basically They bring up the value of the company and then they sell it?
And they sell it.
They sell it to...
Or they take it private from being a public company. So they sell it to, say, a sovereign wealth fund in Saudi Arabia. So there's outside money that people, why do people buy a company? Well, it's profitable and it has a lot of growth, revenue growth, sales growth.
And they keep the margin, basically.
Well, they keep 10%. It's that 2 and 10. So they're getting 10% of it. And then their investors get paid off too. It's like a venture capital fund, but it's private equity. Tucker's against this because when you do the turnaround part of the equation, you're eliminating jobs a lot of the times. You're shipping jobs overseas. And so the workers get screwed. They suffer, they get screwed.
But let me ask this question. So imagine a scenario where you have a failing company and there's no private equity that buys it. But wouldn't that, because it's a failing company, those workers would probably be unemployed, would lose their jobs anyway?
That's what Mitt Romney would say. That's what private equity people would say.
I mean, but I'm just trying to think of it logically, right?
Yeah, that's the argument. That's his argument for private equity. It's like, if it wasn't for us, if it wasn't for us, this company would be totally kaput.
So their argument is what? Like, okay, if we don't buy this company and you go bankrupt, everybody loses their job. Whereas if I come in, I might lay off 10% of the workforce, not everybody, because somebody has to still maintain the operations, right?
Correct.
For me. So their argument is it's actually better if somebody takes it over and makes it into a profitable company again. Okay, interesting. So, hey, Brent, I have another question for you. So you mentioned something about if it's a public company, they make it private. Can you expand on that? So they could buy a public company and then make it private.
Elon Musk was going to buy Twitter and make it private.
Okay.
So
and they make it private.
they would be
Okay.
closer held shares instead of public shares.
Or it could be a private company that they buy, right? And then make it public,
And
right?
make that a publicly traded
A
company.
public company, and then they make money off of the stocks and all that stuff. Okay.
We're getting late in the game. It's about an hour and 20 minutes into this podcast. Do you want to talk about environmentalism?
Yeah, let's go ahead. Yeah, talk about that.
So the elites are, and we had a whole podcast on this with energy and climate change and so forth. But elites and Democrats now consider themselves environmentalists. However, Democrats control.
So-called
If you take
environmentalists,
the top 50 cities in the United States of America, you're going to have Democrats be leading party in the mayorship and in city council. So you have all these cities where Democrats are in charge, and they say they're environmentalists. They may have drives to do recycle and different ways to save and clean energy buses and things like that. But their cities are dirty. Vadim and I just walked to the podcast studio today, and we're in Arlington County, Virginia, one of the wealthiest counties in America.
Yep.
Very affluent. And everybody you talk to it's about 70-30, maybe 75-25 Democrats or Republican. I would say all the Democrats call themselves environmentalists. Vadim and I are spotting trash all over one of the ritziest parts of Arlington County. So not only were we in Arlington County, we're in the ritziest part of Arlington County, and there's trash everywhere. And we want to say, hey, where's the environmentalists? Where's the environmentalists in San Francisco where you have to step over defecation? You know, people who are going poop on the ground, and you're stepping over syringes and things like that. And so Tucker does a good job of where he just says, who are these people? Let's start with cleaning up the United States. Everybody's for a clean environment and clean air and clean water. That should be the number one goal of environmentalists. Yet they focus on bigger issues and fuzzy issues to confuse you, like climate change that has many different definitions. Let's clean up our cities. Let's clean up garbage.
Yes. They focused on these phantom issues like climate change, on abstract issues. As Tucker would say, don't actually improve the environment. Liberals used to be true environmentalists, true conservationists. They would clean up the rivers and lakes and oceans and pick up garbage and national parks. But they have now embraced these abstract issues like climate change that makes them more powerful, makes them rich, but don't actually improve the environment.
Tucker tells a story where he goes fishing in the Potomac River and he has to step over garbage.
I kind of want to emphasize this because this is important. The reason why the Democratic Party has been transformed, it has been transformed on labor issues,
economic issues,
finance,
gender,
illegal immigration, gender, foreign policy, is because they used to be the counterculture. And they've now become the power. That's the main macro takeaway from this podcast. Liberals are now in power. And when you become the power, things that you used to believe in no longer apply.
You know, the liberals are always talking about threat to democracy and authoritarianism. Well, they're in charge. They're in charge of all the institutions. They're in charge of the cities. They're in charge of academia. They're in charge of culture.
And they also
they're in charge of finance. They're in charge of the corporations. And they wonder. You know, they say there's that Republicans are trying to keep people from voting. We had record turnout in 2020. We had more people voting than it used to be in the United States. If you got 50 to 55% of people voting, that was a good election. Remember, there were the days where the Democrats were saying, oh, there's not enough people voting. This is anti-democratic. Well, now more people are voting than we've ever had since the early 20th century. So in almost 80 to 90 years, we had record turnout. What was it, like 81 million people vote?
For Joe Biden?
No, for total. So 81 people voted for Joe Biden.
81 million.
81 million. 77 million, 74 million voted for Trump.
75.
Yeah. So you have a little more.
81 million votes, man.
Yeah, the Democrats tell you that the Republicans are trying to squelch voting just because we believe in voter ID and other ways to make it harder to cheat.
And I think the other important point that we need to understand is the media is no longer holding a powerful account.
Oh, that's a big one.
That's a big one.
Yeah.
And that's important, right? If you have people in power who feel like there's nobody that's checking them, then, they can just call CNN and say, hey, run this. Take this press release and put it into your own blog post or run it on the air. So why are the journalists not interested in keeping the powerful in check? Because they are the powerful.
They are the power. They went to the elite schools.
Yeah, they know these people. Like they're their neighbors. Their kids play on the same softball team, on the same soccer team.
They go to events and they have cocktail parties together, and
that's an important.
So they're part of the elite
that's
too.
An important point. And then when you hear things like accusations of racism, sexism, that's all a diversion from the real issue, which are economic.
Journalists used to be a working class occupation. If you didn't have to have a college degree to be a journalist. It was considered a blue collar work, like Studs Terkel. We talked about Studs. I don't think Studs had a college degree. I think he was a journalist because he wanted to make a difference in terms of holding the powerful accountable. It used to be the left would say, hold the man accountable in the press. Woodward and Bernstein, Watergate. That was all because of people standing up to powerful people. And now the Democrats have their allies in the media.
Do you want to talk about Trump rate?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I am not a huge Trump person, but when I saw the FBI going into Mar-a-Lago, I said to myself, what is happening in this country? What are we becoming? Are we becoming a police state? Are we becoming an authoritarian state where law enforcement is used to punish political rivals? And the White House said they didn't know anything about it. Oh, come on. Merrick Garland probably went to the White House general counsel and told that person what their plans were. I don't believe that at all. So I become more of a Trump supporter because of that raid. I think it was political. I think it was anti-constitutional. I think it was against the Fourth Amendment. I think it was an unusual and serious search that didn't have to happen. The president is the ultimate arbiter of what's considered classified and unclassified. And I think he had a lot of personal documents within that group and I think he was going to eventually go through those documents and write a book probably, but the presidents can determine what is classified and what is unclassified. That's a straw man argument. I don't care if he had nuclear secrets. I think if you have the police, or in this case, the FBI, going against a president, we're saying, what is a crime? Well, we're not going against violent crime. We're not going against murderers. We're going against a president who's a private citizen in his own house, and we're searching him. I mean, I just couldn't believe that happened.
Yeah. Do you think it was a pretext for something to do with January 6th?
No, I think those are two separate events. But the main part is, the January 6th hearings.
They want to get something on him for January 6th.
Yeah, so, and the hearings were part of that. So
they use this classified document as a pretext.
Oh, sure. It's a fishing expedition.
Yeah, they're happy to get Trump on anything. Yeah. But I think January 6th was probably their main motivator.
And the DOJ and the FBI have this policy that they don't have to tell you what's going on. They just say, well, it's an ongoing investigation, no comment. So not only are they doing things against the Constitution in a police state, but they don't have to tell the public what they're doing, and they don't have to be transparent because they have these policies against investigations. So a black mark, a black eye on the United States, where other people look at the United States and say, oh, you guys always talk about non-corrupt government. You talk about democracy. If this happened in another country, we would probably criticize it. But it's okay for 50% of the people to be in favor of using the police against a private citizen and a former president. I think it's totally wrong.
Yeah, I agree. Did you talk about the fact that men are falling behind?
Yeah. I read a bunch of. I read a bunch.
Tucker talks about that, but I just want to highlight something here. So
life expectancy is down.
You hear all this talk about how women are having a hard time, women are being oppressed. But actually, women are doing much better than men these days. They're
going to college more.
Going to college. They're the majority of the workforce now. Men are really falling behind because men need work to feel good about themselves, to have high self-esteem.
And the parties are breaking down by gender. You have single females who are primarily Democrats, not always, but primarily. And then you have working class, high school educated white males who primarily go for Republicans and Trump. So Trump he spoke to the people who are disaffected. And a lot of this started under Obama. I'm highly educated, but during Obama's presidency, I felt like I didn't have a voice. And this was, I was on Twitter, but I wasn't real political. But I just felt like nobody cared about what I said. Now amplify that to the millionth power to somebody who's unemployed and doesn't feel like they're healthy, doesn't feel like life is worth living because they don't have the dignity of a job, and they really feel like nobody listens. And so you get a person like Trump who does listen, who does talk about the working class, who does talk about the loss of jobs, who speaks to those people who are mad about the elites and then that's the rise of Trump.
And Tucker talks about this. Trump's contribution wasn't that he's going to fix all these problems. He can't. He's not really a policy person. He doesn't know how Washington works. He's not really interested in details. But his main contribution was that he raised all these issues, that he asked the fundamental questions that needed to be asked. Why are men doing so bad? Do we really need NATO? Why is the middle class shrinking all of a sudden? It's not good to outsource our manufacturing to China. NAFTA isn't good. Foolish wars. All of these questions that he raised, and that's why they hate him. He raised all these questions that they don't want to talk about. They would rather talk about diversity and climate change and all of these, vanity issues instead of the real issues that matter. But I just want to read this because I think it's important. Something awful is happening to men. What's odd is how rarely you hear it publicly acknowledged. Our leaders pledge to create more opportunities for women and girls, who they imply are failing. The opposite is true. Thanks to intimidation from a relatively small group of influential feminists. Nobody can admit it. The average American man dies 5 years before the average American woman. One of the reasons for this is addiction. Men are more than twice as likely as women to become alcoholics. They're also twice as likely to die of a drug overdose. In New Hampshire, one of the states hit hardest by the opioid crisis, 73% of overdose deaths were men. But the saddest reason for shortened lifespans is suicide. 77% of all suicides are committed by men. Overall rate is increasing at a dramatic pace. Between 1999 and 2014, there was a 43% rise in suicide deaths among middle-aged American men. You often hear of America's incarceration crisis. That's almost exclusively a male problem too. More than 90% of inmates are men. These problems are complex, and they start young. Relative to girls, boys are failing in school. More girls than boys graduate high school. Considerably more go to and graduate from college. Boys account for the overwhelming majority of school discipline cases. One study found that fully 1 in 5 high school boys had been diagnosed with hyperactivity disorder, compared to just 1 in 11 girls. Many were medicated for it. The long-term health effects of those medications aren't fully understood, but they appear to include depression in later life. Women decisively outnumber men in graduate school. They earn the majority of doctoral degrees. They are now the majority of new enrollees in both law and medical schools. For men, the consequences of failing in school are lifelong. Between 1979 and 2010, working-age men with only high school degrees saw their real hourly wages drop about 20%. Over the same period, high school-educated women saw their wages rise. The decline of the industrial economy disproportionately hurts men. About 7 million Americans between the ages of 25 and 54 no longer have jobs. That's more than 10% of the entire working-age male labor force in the United States. Nearly half of these men take pain medication on any given day, the highest rate in the world. Most of them, researchers predict, will never return to work. Some of the causes of this are well known. Competition from lower-priced foreign labor crushed America's manufacturing sector. China's entry into the World Trade Organization alone destroyed more than 2 million American jobs. Automation is killing many more. A disproportionate number of these jobs are in traditionally male industries: manufacturing, agriculture, logging. One 2016 report found that 90% of what welders, cutters, solderers, and brazers do could be replaced by robots. Jobs in which women are the majority tend to be far less vulnerable to automation. 3 of the 5 fastest growing professions are dominated by women. The jobs that remain for men tend to pay far less than the ones that disappeared. As a consequence of this decline, far fewer young men get married than they did just a few decades ago, and fewer stay married. About 1 in 5 American children live with only their mothers. That's double the rate in 1970. Millions more boys are growing up without fathers. Young adult men are now more likely to live with a parent than with a spouse or partner. That is not the case for young women.
Time to wrap up. But the major points to take away from this book and what Tucker is trying to say is the decline of the middle class, and the parties used to be separated by their views on economics. It's no longer the case. Democrats are the party of the rich. Democrats do not worry about labor as much. They don't worry about free speech as much. They see white males as the oppressors. And so take away what you want. It's definitely a good book to read in terms of trying to figure out why the parties have realigned themselves over the years. I think it's a very good study on American politics.
Yes. The important point, again, is that we've seen this convergence of elites into this monoculture that has no interest in addressing the real issues that face American people and the country at large.
All right. Well, we hope you enjoyed this episode. We went a little bit longer than we usually do, but we had so much to talk about. So I hope you see that and do your own research as usual. And we hope you have a good week.
You guys have to read this book, Ship of Fools by Tucker Carlson, #1 on the New York Times bestseller list when it came out in 2018. I want to emphasize this. This book was written pre-COVID. His arguments are even more important post-COVID. We'll link to the book in the show notes. You guys have to read this book. It's a must-read. Tucker Carlson, the best guy in America, the best journalist, a fantastic guy. We love him. Thank you, and we will catch you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Truth Caviar Show. Email us at truthcaviarshow@gmail.com and let us know what you think about the show. And remember, no bias, no bull, no fear, just hard truths.